Well, you've tuned into Hawthorn University's Holistic Health and Nutrition webinar series, and I sure want to thank you so much for joining us as we welcome back David Crow for a two-webinar presentation on botanical antivirals. And my goodness, this is such a timely topic. And for those of you who aren't familiar with his work, David Crow is an acupuncturist and herbalist with over 30 years experience. He's the author of several books, including In Search of the Medicine Buddha. It's a book about his studies of Tibetan and Ayurvedic medicine in the Himalayas. I have to say it's one of my all-time favorite books. He's a well-known lecturer in the field of natural medicine, and Mr. Crow's work is largely focused on the synthesis of botanical medicine, ecology, and spirituality. He's the founder of Floricopia, a company that supports ecologically sustainable agriculture through the production of essential oils and aromatic treasures. So today we're going to look at botanical antivirals, and they're not necessarily rare species known only to herbalists. Some of the most potent compounds are found in common culinary herbs and spices, and knowing how to use these plants in our diets for protection against viral infections is only the beginning of utilizing their powers. Botanical antivirals can be used in a variety of targeted and highly therapeutic ways to address both acute and chronic conditions caused by a variety of virus species. So for the first half of the webinar today, David's going to cover the Fragrant Pharmacy about antivirals of aromatic herbs and spices, and he's going to focus on research that validates the healing effects of antiviral herbs within the human body, the difference between in vitro and in vivo research and what's relevant and applicable in scientific studies on antiviral herbs that should be used in our daily diets for both protection and treatment, the important antiviral compounds found in common herbs and spices, and traditional uses of specific herbs and the modern research confirming their antiviral powers, and then the key differences between the botanical and antiviral drugs. And then in the last half of the presentation, we'll focus on nourishing the essence, addressing immune boosting and antiviral powers of adaptogens. Now, adaptogenic herbs are gaining more and more recognition and popularity for their abilities to nourish and balance and strengthen the immune and nervous and endocrine systems, thereby increasing vitality and resistance to stress and toxins. These herbs also possess significant antiviral powers and are therefore of primary importance for not only boosting immunity against contagious viral infections, but also speeding recovery from acute infections and overcoming the weakening effects of chronic infections. So in this part, David will address how adaptogens are used by medical herbalists to treat virus and species, the antiviral activities and mechanisms of adaptogenic herbs against various viral species, preparation methods, correct dosages, and safe, effective combinations of adaptogens and other antiviral herbs, major species of accessible medicinal mushrooms known for their antiviral effects, and scientific research studies confirming the powers of botanical antiviral herbs. This is a lot of information, so we don't want you to miss a thing. Therefore, this presentation is being recorded and will be available for replay on our website in just a few days. With this much content, David will likely go a full 90 minutes for the presentation, followed by Q&A sessions. So please write your questions or comments into the webinar question panel at any time, and we will certainly respond to your questions and comments at that time. I'm your host, Paula Bartholomew, and now with all that said, it's time to welcome David. It's a pleasure to have you with us again, David.
Thank you, Paula. It's always a pleasure to be here also. And welcome to everybody to this very important subject. And as Paula has introduced very well, there's a lot of information and it's going to go very quickly. So let's just go ahead and jump in. We have two parts to this presentation, as Paula has already introduced. We have the first half on the culinary herbs and spices and the second half on adaptogens. And then we're going to have two more parts coming in a second installment of all of this, but we're going to be weaving together a lot of different threads of information. There's going to be a little bit of comparison between allopathic and classical traditional medicine. And we're also going to be learning some larger groups of herbs and some formulas. So the introduction to this, I'm going to keep it very, very short. But I wanted to give a kind of overview of somewhat of a contradiction or a paradox or maybe even an oxymoron just in the title of this course, because the title of the course indicates something important. And the title is Botanical Antivirals. But if we think about it, that actually represents two different paradigms. One is botanical and the other is antiviral. And botanical medicine implies it's from nature, it's made from plants. That means that it is wild and it's part of the environment, and the plants have their own consciousness and they're all different and they produce different compounds depending on the season and where they're from and so forth. And antiviral means microscopic, and microscopic means allopathic, and it means biochemistry, and it means cellular structures and pharmaceutical research and all these kinds of things. And they're really different models. So what we're trying to do, what I'm trying to do, what many people are trying to do in the field now is to integrate these two models so that we can have scientific validation at a biochemical and a cellular level of what's happening when we ingest these plants, but also there's the interest in all of the plant-derived compounds for new pharmaceutical drugs, which is perfectly valid, has its own set of considerations. That's not what we're going to be talking about, but I'm mentioning it because there's a lot of scientific studies that are in this presentation. And that's okay. It's part of one of the ways to look at plants. And it's important to understand the relationship between allopathic medicine and traditional medicine. So the main point that I want to make here to start us off is that we are integrating two different worldviews, really. If we're talking about antiviral, we're talking about a different worldview than if we're talking about botanical. Now, what I mean specifically by that is that in classical medicine, herbs were used for treating viral infections. They always have been, but there was no diagnosis of a viral infection. That's because they didn't have microscopes, electron microscopes specifically, and they didn't know about the presence of viruses at the microscopic level, but they could see the effects, and they had their own ways of diagnosing, and they had their own language, and they had all of their herbal systems for treating it. So even though they didn't have an understanding of the microscopic realm, they knew its manifestations and knew the herbs that were going to treat the symptoms of the diseases, okay? So now what we have happening is the microscopic realm is taking over in pharmaceutical research anyway, and now we're starting to understand how the plants are actually working at a cellular level. So this is, for some people, a little bit of a stretch. It's a whole new dimension of study and language. There's a whole new world of terminology. And I'm not expecting anybody to read these studies as I go through the slideshow. What I'm going to do is I'm giving you the study, and it has a link to where you can go and you can read it, and it gives the basic information, and I will give you a synopsis of it. Now that's important to look at things in this particular way for several reasons. Well, first of all, because this level of science is brilliant. It's actually confirming a lot of what we know about the plants, and it's also discovering a lot of new things. And it's also driven, a lot of this research is driven by the search for compounds to address the failures of allopathic medicine. So you're going to see in these studies over and over again, antiviral drugs are losing their potency. Antiviral drugs are developing creating resistance, you know, and these epidemics are coming and we need to find answers. And so a lot of the studies are actually motivated by the desire to find answers to suffering, which is great. Some of what the research shows is that it helps us understand why the plants do what they do, how they do it, and sometimes it helps find things about the plant medicine we didn't know before. So there's a lot of very interesting discoveries that are coming out. I'm not going to spend a whole lot more time on this subject, but I just wanted to let you know that that's one of the threads of information that's in this presentation. And if you read through it, you start to delve into, sort of take apart what these studies are about, you're going to discover a lot of really amazing things. You're not going to discover them in this call, because this call is literally hundreds of hours that you could spend studying this material, okay? these studies, going through, reviewing them, assimilating the information, and then connecting it with the herbs. So there's also going to be a lot of formulas that I'm going to cover, and it's going to be a very practical application. There's going to be practical applications of all this information. So let's go ahead and get started. Here's the overview of Module 1, which Paula has already given us, which is basically the botanical antivirals are not just rare species, they're also the ones that are found in the kitchen. And we can now go ahead and start actually, let me say one further thing here, and that is that in this first part, we're going to study very common herbs that are mostly in the aromatic department. Paula already introduced that, but what are those? Ginger, rosemary, Tulsi, basils, peppermint, cinnamon, turmeric, elderberry, lemon balm, and so forth. These are all things that are very easily found in the kitchen, but it's amazing because these have very significant antiviral powers. And now what the reports are showing is what those powers are and how we can use them. Let's go ahead and start now. So James, I didn't thank you at the beginning, and so I'll just thank you now. I'll say thank you, James, back on the admin side. Now, this is our first slide, and as you can see, this is pretty dense material. I mean, we could spend the whole hour just talking about what this is about. Now, I'm just going to sum it up, and I'll just say that this study tells us that a water extract, in other words, tea, of mint family herbs, Lamiaceae family herbs, were tested for their antimicrobial powers. And it then tells us what those plants were. The Lamiaceae family, and those in this study, lemon balm, peppermint, prunella or self-heal, which you're going to hear about in the next one, in the next class, rosemary, sage, and thyme, common plants from the garden, aromatic herbs and spices. So the Lamiaceae plants, all the plants in this study, these are all aromatic, and that means that they're based on essential oils as their primary compound. And if we can easily assume that if a family of herbs shares an active ingredient and they're antiviral, that entire family will most likely be antiviral. And that's the case with the Lamiaceae family. So we can start with this first study that gives us just these 4 plants, okay? Lemon balm and peppermint and prunella and sage and thyme, 5 plants. And these are actually representatives of the broader category of the Lamiaceae family that has thousands of species in it. There's a very high likelihood that every one of those species, since it contains essential oils, and essential oils are highly antimicrobial and antiviral and antifungal, that the antiviral powers of the aromatic plants are going to be spread across this entire family. So what this study tells us, the conclusion of it, is that these plants, or the process of this study, these plants were tested against herpes simplex 1 and 2, and a strain of acyclovir resistant strain of herpes. Now, many of the studies start by mentioning that the antiviral drugs are losing their effectiveness, and that's why they're looking for plant-based compounds. So the study tells us how it works. It works against the virus before it invaded the host cells, but not once it was inside. One of the things you're going to hear over and over again is the mechanism. Where in the life cycle of the virus did a particular compound intercept it and disrupt it? And that's pharmaceutical thinking. That's antiviral thinking. But there's a lot more that we can add, because the herbs are also taking care of other systems as well. They're for example, if we use lemon balm for herpes outbreaks, it has a calmative effect on the nervous system. It's antiviral. It's relaxant on the digestive system. It's immune boosting. So the herbs are working much more holistically than just at these exact mechanisms where the viruses can be disturbed or disrupted. So there's a basic point here to understand, which is that this information is in vitro. Okay, that means in a petri dish. And we are in vivo, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the herbs don't work. It's just that they work in a different way in the human body. So what does this mean in terms of the application of this information for us if we have outbreaks of herpes virus? So lemon balm is relaxant. it's very helpful to drink strong infusion of lemon balm during a herpes outbreak. And if we look at the other ones, the other herbs mentioned here, thyme, for example, is an important immune boosting herb. And rosemary is an important nerve tonic, which is helpful for protecting against the outbreaks of the virus. And peppermint is good for balancing the terrain of the digestive tract, which has a lot to do with the cycle of the outbreaks. And so therefore, all of these diverse functions help to reduce the frequency and the severity if we're using the tea. This study simply tells us what they're doing in the cells, that's all. So this is the difference between herbs and drugs. Really, is that the drugs are targeting something very specific, and they're very focused against very specific stages of viral replication usually. But the herbs are working on many different levels at the same time, and they're also doing this. All right. There's also the fact that there's lots of ways to take the herbs. There's the tea, and then there's the essential oils, and the inhalation, and the creams, and the salves for external preparations, and so forth. So the in vitro tells us about their mechanisms of actions, but the herbal background information tells us what the plants actually do. All right, now here's something, I'm going to start speeding it up now. This is just for future reference, because you're going to be hearing about a lot of these studies, and they mention things like they prevent attachment of the virus to the cell, okay? Or they disrupt its takeover of the replication process, or it stops it before it ejects all the new virus particles into the body. So there's all of these stages of the life cycle of the virus. And if you study these reports, you're going to learn that specific compounds in plants interfere with specific processes. And that's what they're looking for. They want to take a compound and they want to make a drug out of it, and they want to administer it to the person so that that one compound goes to this one process. But as it turns out, the herbs work in much more complex ways, all right? And the more complex, the less likelihood that there is of developing resistance. All right, let's see. Let's go now to our first herb, which everybody knows. Here is ginger. And now let's see what the science tells us. They know about ginger at the antiviral level. Well, the first study tells us that ginger has antiviral activity against the human respiratory syncytial virus, which is also called HRSV. And you'll hear about that in just a moment, what that does, but it causes respiratory infections, basically. And so the way that it works is that it blocks the viral attachment, as I just pointed out, and it doesn't allow the virus to go into the cell. So it can't, basically it can't invade at the cellular level. So does that mean that, but it also says that the fresh and not dried ginger is most effective, or it says fresh but not dried. So does that mean that dried ginger is worthless? No, it just means that it doesn't block the viral attachment at this particular level. But dried ginger is used all the time to treat respiratory infections. So the second report is a classical Chinese formula, and you find a lot of these studies that are out there. They're testing formulas that have been around for hundreds of years to confirm that they do something. And well, guess what they're finding? They're finding out that, oh, well, those old doctors must have known something. So this one's called the minor blue dragon formula, and it's got cinnamon and peony, ginger, licorice, Pinellia, schizandra. And one of the things that's interesting about these studies is that you can learn these formulas. So this minor blue dragon, this is available. It's a very common Chinese formula that's available through retail sources. And what it tells us here is that it also inhibits the cytopathic effect of human respiratory syncytial virus in cell lines of human respiratory tract. So in other words, this protects respiratory cells from the damaging effects of this particular virus. So what have we been talking about here? We've been talking about the HRSV, or RSV for short. It's a family of viruses that cause respiratory tract infections, and it's a major cause of lower respiratory tract infections and hospital visits during infancy and childhood especially. But it's also becoming more common among elderly patients. Okay, so this is a major virus that usually affects children in their first few years. Here in the US, about 60% of infants are infected in their first year with something like this. So what does that mean for us? Well, maybe introducing children to ginger tea can help protect them from this. And to keep in mind that ginger tea has lots of other functions other than its antiviral power. Specifically now confirmed against this virus that causes respiratory problems. All right, the next one here is that we're looking at ginger again, but in this case, it's a combination of ginger and clove. Now, one of the interesting things about doing this kind of research is that we learned that there's a lot of research going on for all kinds of purposes, and what they're doing here in this study is that they're looking for food preservatives that are antimicrobial. And what they say here is that the foodborne viruses, particularly the human norovirus, is a concern of public health in our food. So what would they like to do? What they're trying to do here is they're studying these different things like ginger and jalapeno peppers and things like that, clove, and they're doing it in a surrogate line of cells, which means that they're using a cell line that will do something that they're looking for. That's what that refers to. And the conclusion of the study is that these results showed that the water extract of clove and ginger have promise for prevention of foodborne viral contamination. Now, you may wonder, well, does that mean that clove and ginger are going to be used as food preservatives? Well, that's how they always have been used, actually. That's why Columbus set off to sail off the edge of the world. He was looking for spices because spices played such a very important role in food preservation because of their antimicrobial powers. Now, you may think, well, that's going to make everything taste like ginger or clove, but they probably have some way of changing that. And besides, I would rather have something like that in the food chain than eat sulfur dioxide and sodium benzoate and things like that. Let's take a look at what comes next year. Here is the norovirus that it was referring to. This is the most common cause of gastroenteritis. Now, one of the things that we can say about these aromatic herbs is that they work directly on viral infections of the digestive tract because we can drink them as tea. Okay, they're not in the liver. We can come directly into contact with them. We can bring the plant material, the essential oil compounds, the antiviral compounds directly into contact with the virus. And that makes a huge difference. So it's easier in a lot of ways to treat digestive viral infections and respiratory infections because we can breathe essential oils and it will come directly into contact. And we can drink the teas and it will come directly into contact. Whereas other things that are deeper in the body, it's more complex. So this is the norovirus, the most common cause of gastroenteritis. It's what you brought back from Mexico or what you had when you were down there. So there's about 685 million cases of this every year. And it's nice to know that ginger works against it. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that ginger is most famous for is digestive infections. So it's also known, lots of research confirming it, but also the classical folk medicine is that it's one of the best herbs for vomiting and for stomach pain and nausea. And now we know that it will treat this particular virus. So this is a report that tells us something interesting about the way the pharmaceutical researchers are thinking. And that is that they're looking for isolated compounds. And this is a report that tells us about one of the compounds that they're looking for, which is sesquiterpene compound. And it tells us that they found this sesquiterpene in ginger that has activity against the rhinovirus, anti-rhinoviral activity. And then it says specifically that it was beta sesquiphilandrine. And well, okay, it doesn't tell us what the mechanism is against the rhinovirus, but it tells us that a primary compound has the most antiviral power. And this is how they find these new drugs. And it's also how the herb industry and the essential oil industry learn how to identify some of the compounds that need to be standardized. So for example, with tea tree, there is a compound called terpenine 4-ol, OL, alcohol, that has been determined to be one of the major antibacterial components of tea tree. And so now quality control standards have set it for a certain level in tea tree oil. So in other words, when you go to the health food store and it says standardized at this level, standardized at that level, it means they now know that certain compounds are primary ingredients and you want to get those at a particular level for it to be most effective. So let's go on here, and here is the rhinovirus, the most common viral infectious agent in humans and the predominant cause of the common cold. That's pretty straightforward. Now let's see what we know about ginger. Well, we know a lot of things about ginger, and this just kind of sums it up very quickly. We know that it's very good in the digestive system, carminative, it treats indigestion, bloating, nausea, all these kind of things, and it's very good for the respiratory system, but also very good for the circulatory system, and it's an immune system booster. And it's also relaxant for the uterus, helps to warm the abdomen and reduce menstrual pain, and it's also good in formulas for the joints, internally and externally. So ginger is working on many, many levels, and the point here is just to know that it has these antiviral compounds. Is it going to save us from COVID-19? Well, it could be part of a program that we are doing if we find ourselves treating ourselves for it, and certainly recovering from it if we get it. So this is just an overview then of ginger, just to introduce some of the methodology that I'm following here. Now there's several factors when we talk about, well, what is this herb going to do, really? Okay, in vitro, in vivo, what's it going to do? And there's factors that determine the effectiveness of the botanical antivirals. And so first of all, there's the virus. It means the species of the virus and the virulence and the drug resistance of the virus. So in other words, if you have a strain of drug-resistant herpes, it's more difficult than a strain that isn't resistant to the drugs, all right? And if you're dealing with Ebola, it's a lot worse than dealing with rhinovirus. So that's one of the first criteria. What is the infection? How deadly is it, or how mild is it? Then there's the individual, and that is the strength of the immune system, underlying health conditions, the age, the constitution, the level of health consciousness, meaning what's the history of using natural medicine? And this is one of the things that's coming out now with COVID-19, is that it's the underlying pathologies that have been there all along that are actually causing the more serious cases. So in other words, the virus is attacking people who are weaker and taking advantage of the weakened systems. So if people are stronger, the virus can't be so opportunistic. That's simple. That's just how nature works. Medications are a factor here. And what resources does a person have? Because a person can be strong and healthy and they can get hit very heavily with something and not be able to treat it, and it can really knock them down. But all of these kinds of things all go into this equation of how effective are herbs going to be. And in general, the older we are, the more immune compromised we are, and the more complex the condition and underlying conditions, and the more medications we're on, the more complicated it is to use herbs in general, because people are going to be more sensitive in their digestive tract. There's potential of herb-drug interactions, although it's not that high. It's just something we have to think about. All of these different kinds of things become more complicated. The older we are, the weaker we are, the more medication we're on and so forth. Then the final consideration is what organ or tissue system is affected, and is the situation acute or chronic. So here's just a series of reports here. And again, we're looking at Lamiaceae family. Well, actually, let me say a few other things here. Let me go back to this one here. And I just want to give people realistic expectations here. And first of all, there's no guarantee about anything when it comes to treatments. There's no guarantee about antiviral drugs working anymore, which is what all this science is being driven by, okay? And there's also no guarantee that the herbs are going to work either. That's why I posted this particular set of criteria, so that people can have realistic expectations, because the more reality-based we are, the less disappointed we're going to be, and that also helps us to focus a program much more effectively. A lot of what's happening right now is internet medicine, and internet medicine is driven heavily by marketing or by panic, and it's very, very confusing, and all kinds of people are being told, oh, this is going to do this and you'll be safe, but it's not that way. All right, maybe it will be a contributing factor to improving your immune system, and maybe that will help you, or maybe not. So we have to really think critically. We have to learn how to think like clinicians when we're looking at this information and putting it into perspective. And we have to understand this difference between herbs and drugs very clearly, because antiviral drugs are primarily attacking agents, all right? And they don't correct the underlying terrain in the body. They make it worse. Now, the antiviral herbs can also attack, especially some of the stronger ones that we're going to look at in the next presentation, actually. But that attacking power is not always as strong as the drugs, because they have diverse compounds, okay? But the benefit is that herbs are not going to produce the toxic side effects that the drugs do, or microbial resistance. And we know that because the plant-based compounds have been protecting the plants from viruses, fungi, and bacteria in the environment for millions of years. And that's the proof that they work. So a lot of the herbs that are strongly antiviral, however, like the really strong bitter herbs, can be hard on the digestive system. They're not entirely biocompatible, and so that's where the formulas come in. We have to know how to mix them with certain things to protect the body. Herbs have one other very important point, one other power here, which is that they nourish the body and they build immunity. And antiviral drugs can't do that, obviously. All right, now let's go on. So this is just continuing with the Lamiaceae family. And there are many, many plants, like I said, thousands of species in the Lamiaceae family. That's the mint family. And that includes things like salvia, sages, and there's over 1,000 species just of sages. So here's more studies, and these are looking at HIV, all right? And these are the retroviruses, and the retroviruses are named because of the way that they reproduce themselves. And these are generally more powerful viruses. They cause serious diseases. Rhinovirus does not cause a serious disease, but a retrovirus like HIV does, okay? So what these studies are telling us is that these plants, these simple kitchen spices, have evidence that they can be helpful against the retroviruses here, okay? And of course, they all end with the hope that some drug is going to be found. But what they're talking about here is rosemary, savory, self-heal, prunella, hyssop, lemon balm. There's a whole list that they give here in the first study. And in the second study, what they're giving here is a conclusion that these extracts may provide a basis for the development of novel virucidal topical microbicides. Okay, so things that are toxic to microbes. All right, like I said, there's a lot of information here, and we don't have to understand the details. We just have to understand the conclusion, which is that they're researching these simple plants from the kitchen, and they're finding that they can inhibit HIV in different ways. And one of these is rosemary. And what they're looking at specifically, and some of you may have heard of rosmarinic acid. Rosemary is one of the sources of rosmarinic acid. Here we can see that a certain compound can also appear in different plants. So rosmarinic acid is not just in rosemary, it's also in lemon balm, and it's also in a number of other things. It's in spearmint. There's quite a number of the Lamiaceae family, actually, where rosmarinic acid is found. So in this case, what we see then is that a compound which is found in several plants is being used for specific purposes. So if we go through and just look at the titles of this, what we see is that, okay, rosmarinic acid, a novel inhibitor of hepatitis B, okay. Another study that it's against Enterovirus 71, and another study of Melissa extract and its active constituent, rosmarinic acid, that it is also good for prophylactic uses for EV71, and that rosmarinic acid, they conclude by saying that it acts as a potent antiviral agent against Japanese encephalitis. That's pretty interesting. And if we know that rosmarinic acid in rosemary acts against Japanese encephalitis, then probably if we drink rosemary tea, it's going to be good for our brain, which it is. But this is just a different way of looking at it. And what we're doing is we're connecting a lot of dots about how the plants work. And we see that, oh, well, rosemary is neuroprotective. You've probably heard that. Well, this is maybe one of the ways that it's working. And then we see, again, another Enterovirus 71 study. And here is from the first study here. Rosmarinic acid is a novel inhibitor of hepatitis B. And here's hepatitis B, okay, an infectious disease that affects the liver. About a third of the world population has been infected at one point in their lives, and about 391 million people had chronic infection in 2017, and 750,000 people die of hepatitis B each year, and about 300,000 due to liver cancer. So one of the concepts that we should really think about here, we are all very much involved now. All of us have been affected in different ways by the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which causes COVID-19 illness. And, excuse me. And what we frequently lose sight of, unless we're actually working in the medical field and doing research like this, is that there's pandemics of viral diseases going on all the time. It's not just COVID-19. And that's why knowing these herbs is really important, because a lot of the information that's coming out in the research, it's actually telling us, excuse me, it's actually telling us that a lot of these epidemics are getting worse. And there's all kinds of new ones coming all the time also. So what we're living in is an age of increasing health threats. And that's directly connected to the breakdown of the environment and breakdown of society and economic inequality and environmental pollution and the health of the biosphere and many, many things. But microbes take advantage of this. They take advantage of weak immune systems. They take advantage of weak economies. They take advantage of weakness in all systems. So when we think about the power of antiviral herbs, the conclusion that I always come to is, well, we should just be using them now, because there's all kinds of things going on. And the kitchen spices are a very good place to start. All right, let's go on. Here it is, Tulsi Tea. And here's a simple recipe. I'm going to be giving you recipes as we go, and they're going to become increasingly complex. So 1 teaspoon of dry herb per cup hot water, steep 5 to 10 minutes, a half a cup 3 to 4 times a day. And you can combine this with some essential oils like eucalyptus, okay? And let's look at a few studies now about Tulsi. What do the scientists tell us? Well, we know what the traditional doctors say, which is that Tulsi is good for everything, that it's good for colds and flus. And if it's good for colds and flus, then it's been used for viral infections for a long time. But the first study is kind of in that particular category, actually. There's lots of studies like this, which is that scientists confirm what people have always known. All right, it's a nice confirmation. And the second study actually gives us more information about what the herb does. It's antimicrobial, it's immune boosting, and it makes reference to eugenol, which is a specific compound that is one of the main compounds that is antiviral. And eugenol is what makes clove smell and taste like clove. And so if you are diffusing Tulsi essential oil, that's why it smells like cloves in your house. And that's why drinking Tulsi has a slight clove-like taste. That's also why if you put Tulsi essential oil on your skin, it'll burn you, all right? So don't do that. We'll talk about that later. Here's basil, and basil's in the Lamiaceae family. And what does the research tell us about basil? Well, the first shows us that basil has anti-HIV effects in vitro. And the second one tells us that science has confirmed that both basil and hyssop have antimicrobial powers. And I'm sorry, I got my reports mixed up here. Yeah, that's correct. So the first one is that it's basil. The second one is that it is basil and hyssop. And also a third species, and I don't actually know what that is, but then this final study here tells us that basil inhibits the entry of the Zika virus into the cells. So this is pretty important information because, as you'll see here in the study, it says the extract seems to inhibit the virus at the step of attachment and entry into the host cell. And this suggests a new alternative mode of treatment against this flavivirus. And well, are we seeing or treating Zika? No, but it's one of those emerging potential epidemics. And here it is. It's related to dengue, yellow fever, Japanese encephalitis, West Nile viruses. And we hear about these outbreaks periodically. All right, next one, peppermint. And what does this tell us about peppermint? A very simple thing. It was looking at the antiviral, inflammatory, and antioxidant effects of ethanol extract. That means a tincture of peppermint. And what did it find? It found that it showed antiviral activity against the RSV that you have met before. And so that's the common cold producing virus. And here we have a formula, and this is a respiratory viral formula. Ginger, cinnamon, simmer them together. Take it hot so you'll sweat. And then you can put in a dropper of echinacea, a dropper of licorice, okay? And then Rabansara essential oil is one of the main antiviral essential oils. There's tea tree, eucalyptus, lavender. These all are very nicely antiviral, antimicrobial in general. A study here that cinnamon inhibited the HRSV, the human respiratory syncytial virus, by preventing viral attachment, okay? And lots of other mechanisms as well. Do you recognize this? This is in your kitchen. This is turmeric. Well, how many studies do you think have been done on turmeric? I think that it's something like 1,200 studies now on turmeric and curcumin. And there's a lot of ways to use it. And here are some studies about it. Here's a variation of that last formula that I just gave you. And this is basically with ginger and turmeric instead of ginger and cinnamon. And you can simmer that, or you can make you can substitute the fresh turmeric with a little bit of powder or tincture instead. So the first study about it is about its antiviral powers. And what it tells us, basically both of these studies tell us that curcumin is the active ingredient, and that curcumin has antiviral actions against different viruses, including the influenza H1N1 virus. All right, and so this one was actually a big topic a few years ago, H1N1. This is a very nice chart. Sometimes we can come across these in the longer reports. And what it does is it sums up all the different things that one compound will do. So this is the antiviral activities of turmeric, curcumin longa. And what it shows is, okay, the compound, and then it shows the virus that it works against. But there are several compounds that works against HIV and tea, basically, aqueous extract. And so here's a list of the viruses that everybody will get a quiz on at the end of the class. HIV, human immunodeficiency virus, HSV, that's herpes simplex, HBV, hepatitis B, HCV, hepatitis C, HPV, human papillomavirus, JEV, Japanese encephalitis virus, and HTLV1, which is the human T lymphotropic virus. Okay. Now I put in elderberry because it should be in the kitchen. It's not an aromatic, but it's a food. And here are some ways to use it. There's a formula for colds and flus. Here it's mixed with elder flowers, yarrow flowers, linden flowers, peppermint, and that's for sweating. Then in part 2, after you've made yourself hot with a diaphoretic kind of tea, then you cool down. Rosehip powder, or pieces in infusion basically, and take that with elderberry syrup. Now there's lots of studies about elderberry. When you start doing this research, you find some things are really popular and well known and other things are not. They're focusing on certain compounds, focusing on curcumin, focusing on berberine, focusing on elderberry. There's a lot of things that they're also not looking at so much. But here's a few simple things about elderberry here. Excuse me. I'm chewing ginger root for my throat while I'm speaking so fast. And what do these studies about elderberry tell us? Well, the first one is a compound that comes from geranium and elderberry. So we learned a lot of things about blending also. And this compound has a very strong effect blocking the replication of 2 types of influenza virus. And the second one is a clinical trial. That means it's done in people as opposed to in mice or in petri dishes. And the results are that people using elderberry syrup for treating influenza had their symptoms relieved an average of 4 days earlier and needed less of other medications. So these are the nice kinds of things that you find in these studies. And then here we have 2 more studies about elderberry. The first one tells us that elderberry is both antibacterial and antiviral for influenza virus. And the second is what is called a meta-analysis of randomized controlled clinical trials that showed that elderberry can substantially reduce upper respiratory symptoms, and that this gives us an alternative. And I like the way that these researchers put it, because they're being very honest here. They said, these findings present an alternative to antibiotic misuse for upper respiratory symptoms due to viral infections. And it's amazing, the doctors are still giving antibiotics for viruses. Okay, what comes next here? Lemon Balm, still in the Lamiaceae family. And here, 3 studies about lemon balm. The first, it inhibits the attachment of drug-resistant herpes in vitro. And in the second, it shows that essential oil of lemon balm inhibits herpes before it gets into the cell, but not once it's in the cell. However, it is very lipophilic, which means that it can be applied on the lesions and it will penetrate in. And then the third, we learned that a formula for application for herpes can be made with lemon balm and sumac and rosemary and geranium. And here I'll mention that geranium essential oil is one of the main essential oils that can be mixed with lemon balm essential oil and applied safely to the outbreak, whether it's genital, whether it's shingles, or whether it's on the lips as cold sores. Okay, those 2 essential oils can be applied directly. All right, what comes next? Here is a formulary. Now, why am I putting out formulas for stress and tension? Well, first of all, you're going to see that they have lemon balm over and over, lemon balm, lemon balm, lemon balm. And stress and tension is also one of the main things that triggers herpes. So isn't that nice that herbs that relax the nervous system also have antiviral powers against herpes? A lot of things for you to study here, both herbs and essential oil combinations. And nowadays, I would say it's fairly safe to say that these formulas are widely applicable. Now here we can shift over, and that's winding down our little discussion about the aromatics. Now we're going to transition over to the adaptogens, part 2. And this tells us that there are different groups of herbs and they have different levels of potency against the viruses. This list goes from milder. So the first part is adaptogens, okay, which is where we are now, and part 2. And adaptogens are primarily immune supporting with secondary antimicrobial powers. They work primarily through the HPA axis, which I'll explain in a minute. They are trophorestoratives, which means that they balance tissues and organs, and they're primarily tonics, like chi tonics, blood tonics from Chinese medicine. Or from Ayurveda, we hear the term ojas, rejuvenators. So these are antiviral, but they're more in the category of immune boosting tonics with secondary antiviral powers. Then we have the aromatic herbs that we just completed. These are both immune boosting and antimicrobial. They have direct antiviral actions, but they also work on regulating the terrain. For example, the mucous membranes of the respiratory and digestive systems. They are antibiotic, probiotic, eubiotic, meaning they balance the terrain. And they have a wide range of other functions like anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, and so on. The next group are antivirals that are targeting the respiratory system. And we'll get into that in the last part of the next presentation. So that's part 4. These are strongly antiviral. They are often strongly detoxifying. They can potentially damage the terrain. These are things like OSHA root or golden seal, things like that, okay? Or andrographis is a better example that's getting a lot of attention now. If you take too much, they have some potential toxicity. The next strongest are going to be the alkaloid-based bitters. And that's going to include golden seal, actually, and things like coptis, the berberine-based plants. And these can be toxic and damaging to the terrain. In other words, you take too much golden seal, it's going to upset your stomach. And if you take it for too long, it could actually start to cause some low-grade toxicity in your system. It'll certainly irritate your digestive tract far in advance of that, though. So that's starting to get more into the concentrated pharmaceutical kind of approach, and that's why they're so interested in berberine, is that it is such a powerful compound and it is very, very targeted. And when we get up to this level of potency, then we have to learn how to formulate, all right? Then we have to understand that when you take golden seal, you should take it with ginger to protect the digestive terrain. And finally, the most concentrated are the essential oils, and that's because they're distilled. They're extracted families of compounds. These are powerfully antimicrobial, but they're also highly toxic. And they're not biocompatible. Don't let any marketing rep tell you that you can take undiluted essential oils internally, because they're toxic and you will get burned eventually. Even if you really like the immune boosting effect you're getting now from taking the lemon oil on the water, it's going to have a cumulative effect. You will increase the likelihood of giving yourself permanent esophageal damage eventually. Taking 2 or 3 drops of lemon oil on a glass of water once or twice a day is the equivalent of eating 5 or 6 lemons. Why? Why do that? Okay, that's marketing. All right. So here is the definition of adaptogens. The short definition is that it is an herb that helps us adapt to stress. The longer definition is that it harmonizes, strengthens, and balances the axis, okay, the conjunction of the immune system, endocrine, and nervous systems. There's other terms. There is the HPA axis. This is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal. This is the main target of adaptogenic herbs. But there's also the HPO axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary gonadal axis. And then there's the sympathoadrenal system. So basically what this is the relationship between the nervous system and the endocrine system primarily. Here's a few criteria for an herb to be an adaptogen. One is that the substance is relatively non-toxic. That's compared to like the berberine plants, which can be toxic. It has non-specific activity, and it acts by increasing resistance to a broad spectrum of adverse biological, chemical, and physical factors, and it helps to regulate or normalize organ functions. This is very different than a lot of other categories of herbs. Some of the herbs, like the aromatics, they have some of these properties, but the adaptogens are classed based on these criteria. Basic functions of adaptogens: they regulate metabolism, they improve carbohydrate metabolism, they counter the physiological effects of stress. That is the main defining criteria of an adaptogen, is that it counters the physiological effects of stress. All right, let me catch up here on my other screen here to where we are. And let's take a look at our first adaptogen. This is a classic adaptogen. This was the first plant to actually be classified fully with this criteria as an adaptogen. Schizandra. Schizandra is a source of great fascination to the pharmaceutical researchers now. It has a lot of studies. Many, many interesting compounds are being researched. And let's go ahead and take a look at what they are. First, this first report gives us an overview of the numerous therapeutic benefits of schizandra. And this comes from classical Chinese medicine, treatment of gastrointestinal diseases, respiratory failure, cardiovascular, fatigue, weakness, excess sweating, insomnia. Schizandra is also reported to reduce hunger. Here's one we all want. Delay aging, increase vitality, and improve mental health. That's because it is neuroprotective, hepatoprotective, anti-inflammatory, antioxidant, detoxifies. It's an immunostimulant, and it has antiviral and anti-cancer activities, as well as cardiovascular and skin protective properties. That's why schizandra is so famous, because it does so many things. Now, the second report shows us that it comes from a particular region, and it also tells us the best species. So this is another benefit of the research, is that there's a lot of information that comes out that tells us we examined this species of schizandra against this species of schizandra and found that this one has more of the therapeutic compounds. Well, the traditional herbalists knew all of that from centuries of use. And they also know that herbs came from different places, different regions that were famous for being the highest quality. And that was usually because of soil, weather, climate, ecophysiology goes into the compounds in the plants. So this one tells us that it is looking at the 4 different species growing wild in the Qinling Mountains in China. This is all very interesting from the ethnobotanical standpoint. And it's also classical herbology as well, to know where the best herbs come from. And it used to be that when people went out and harvested herbs, they knew all of the different ecosystems. They knew that if you harvested this plant on the dry southern side of a mountain higher up, where it was always really hot, okay, that it's a totally different plant than the same species growing down by the stream on the northern side of the mountain, where it's getting a lot of water. So these are all things that go into the ecophysiology of what makes herbs herbs. So let's see what comes next. More studies, imagine that. And this is about one of the compounds, schizandronic acid. And what does it do? It inhibits the entry of HCV into the hepatocytes. In other words, it's hepatoprotective. It blocks the entry of hepatitis C into the liver. That's something that we would like to know about. So this is really the future of medicine. Is there's going to be a lot of these kind of compounds coming out, and what we're going to learn pretty soon is that they're already in use. Actually, they're already being injected. They're being given in IVs. They're being given in all kinds of products. And we have a few of them. I mean, berberine, which we're going to study next time, is one of the ones that's now available. A plant-derived compound, although it's being synthesized more and more, a plant-derived compound originally that is now being given by a lot of naturopathic practitioners. And you can find it on the health food store shelf. We're going to be seeing more and more of these kind of nutraceutical plant-derived compounds available, and they're already being used in different parts of the world with great success for very specific things. And my position is that, well, if it helps, if it relieves suffering, then it's fine. Of course, there are some medical considerations about concentration levels, biocompatibility, toxicity, and all of these things are part of the considerations that all the pharmaceutical researchers have also. They are also looking at cytotoxicity, okay? They're looking at how much is necessary to get the therapeutic effect and how much will actually cause poisoning in the body. So this is a very fascinating subject. Let's move on here. And what does this one tell us? This tells us about the development of semi-synthetic drugs from compounds isolated from Schizandra. And it also tells us that drugs for chronic hepatitis are available in Asia, but not the United States. All right, so here it is. This particular brand of this semi-synthetic compound is regarded as the most potent anti-hepatotoxic substance. Well, why haven't we heard about that? It's being used in the treatment of chronic viral hepatitis and chemical or drug-induced hepatic damage, and it's available in Southeast Asian countries in commonly practiced therapies. You find out all kinds of things in these medical databases. And here is another one of those charts, and this is about that particular compound. These lignans, a particular family of compounds that are extracted from Schizandra, and this is what they do. So you can see anti-cancer, antiviral, hepatoprotective. Here's another one, antiviral, another one, hepatoprotective. So many things that these compounds from Schizandra do. Schizandra is a major source of major compounds that are receiving major attention. All right. What does this one do? This Schizandrin A inhibits dengue viral replication by upregulating the antiviral interferon responses. So this is all way above my head. Okay, most of the time, most of this language, it's not the way I think. It's a whole new language, but I find it fascinating. It's very interesting. What I am learning, and I've actually been doing this kind of research now for many years. I probably started doing this 20 years ago, but I've really gotten into it lately. And it's a kind of process of filtering out a lot of stuff. So don't get scared by these studies. Just read the title and then read the conclusion. That's all. That's all you need to do. You don't need to worry about all the details of all these methods that they use that we're never going to learn about. We're never going to do unless you're really interested in being a pharmaceutical researcher. So what's the whole point of this? Is that basically this schizandrin, this lignin, okay, from Schizandra, represents a potential antiviral agent to block dengue virus. Okay, that's all it comes down to. So what does that mean? Well, we can take Schizandra. Is it going to have hepatoprotective effects? Yes. Will that reduce our likelihood of contracting hepatitis? Yes. Is that incredibly important? Yes. And what if we have had hepatitis? Well, it's going to be good for us in that case also. So here are some formulas. With Schizandra for various purposes. Okay, sorry, I'm confusing my screens here. These are different formulas you can take. For example, we have chronic adrenal overstimulation. That's another epidemic. And we can take Lemon Balm and we can add Schizandra as a tincture. Schizandra can be taken as a tincture or as a tea of the berries. We can take Schizandra for a long period of time for neurodegenerative conditions. And what you'll notice here is that you're going to take a cup of the tea 3 times a week, 1 cup of tea 3 times a week. And you're going to take a tincture of Schizandra and goji berries. Okay, well, that's not very frequent. But the point is that if you're going to take herbs for a long time, for months and months, you don't want to take them 3 times a day. You want to take them 3 times a week instead. It's just a different way of thinking about the dosing. Then we have a formula here for improving endurance, ability to cope with stress. Schizandra is there. How about gently detoxifying the digestive system? Schizandra is there also. And now we're talking about astragalus. And astragalus, of course, is famous now because everybody is concerned about immune boosting. And that's good. Everybody should be thinking about their health. But it's not just the immune system, because people want to be taking care of all those underlying conditions of metabolic disorder. You know, one of the things that's come out about COVID-19 is that about 70% of the serious pneumonia cases and complications with blood clotting and all these things that have happened, 70% of those cases are men. And about 70% of those men have underlying clear cases of metabolic syndrome, overweight, abdominal obesity, high triglycerides, all those kinds of things. So when people ask, well, what herb should I take to prevent the blood clotting of COVID-19? I say that's irrelevant. Take care of the metabolic syndrome. Take care of the underlying health condition first. Now, astragalus is famous now because it is an immune boosting tonic, and it's not here because it's an adaptogen. It's famous as an immune booster, okay? But I'm putting it in because it combines so nicely with these other adaptogens in these formulas. So this study tells us that astragalus is used for Qi deficiency. That's what adaptogens are also used for. And it shows us that there's different species that are being researched, and it tells us that reports on 46 different species found 200 compounds, and it has antiviral powers. And the second report here is that it tells us that it has obvious herpes simplex inhibiting efficacy and low cytotoxicity. In other words, it's a safe herb for the cells. That's what cytotoxicity means. All right, let's go ahead and get my other screen caught up here. Moving along, I think I'm more or less on time. I might be a little bit late. I might leave a couple of pages for you to review on your own. So this is a type of review that tells us that astragalus has multiple functions. It points to the most important compound, its potential as a product, and for our discussion, the most important functions are proliferation of immune cells, okay? It also affects immunoglobulins and conduction of immune signals. It has antiviral effects and antimicrobial effects in general. Lots of reading material here for you. And this one is just like it sounds, is that it protects cells from influenza virus. It protects a particular kind of cell used in this type of research from influenza virus by regulating a specific aspect of one of its metabolic pathways. So what? Well, we should take astragalus. That's what it means. Because the ultimate conclusion here is that it's antiviral and it protects us from the influenza. All right, here are some formulas for protecting us from influenza. And I will just speed things up here because it looks like my time is almost up. I'm going to cover about 40 slides in about 15 minutes here, but a lot of these are formulas. And these are things for you to come back to and refer to. So boosting respiratory immunity, you're going to find astragalus. Increasing vitality and immunity, you're going to find astragalus. Here's another one. This is something that a lot of people know about. They may not have seen it like this. This is chaga. There's a lot of studies about chaga for antiviral purposes. Here are 3 studies, and the first one tells us that the chaga mushroom protects cells that are infected with herpes simplex. And the second one tells us that chaga is popular in Europe and Asia, and that the water extract exhibits marked decrease in herpes virus. And then it explains the mechanism of how it does that. The third study tells us that 90% of mice that were given tea of chaga survived lethal injections of herpes simplex virus. Well, you know, I don't feel good about this kind of in vivo studies, but at the same time, this is important information to know about, that if you take let's just transpose this over to a human population and say, well, all right, that means if you were to start injections of chaga, that will give you significant protection against extremely high levels of viral infection. Well, what does it mean for us? On a practical level, it means, well, we should start taking chaga, especially if we have chronic viral infections. And those, of course, are going to be HIV, and they're going to be Epstein-Barr and herpes. Those are probably the three most common chronic infections that people are dealing with. There's others, of course, but anybody who has HIV, managing Epstein-Barr, and managing herpes, chaga is very important to add to that. All right, let's see what comes next. Moving right along. Well, here it is, the herpes simplex 1 and 2. Okay, and this causes a lot of suffering around the world. 3 more studies about chaga here, and one is that it has the potential to control the Norovirus. That's the one that causes gastroenteritis. Second is that it inhibits replication of HIV. And the third tells us about 2 isolated compounds that came from chaga that have considerable antiviral activity against influenza 1 and 2 types. And next set of studies, the first tells us that chaga kills the hepatitis C virus, both preventively and with infection. And the second tells us that there are several species of medicinal mushrooms that were found to be highly effective against West Nile virus and herpes simplex 2. So I'm just summing these up for you. Oh, and here we have a little diversion, some entertainment here. This is about Utsi, the Iceman. Well, he wasn't feeling so great when they found him as the glacier melted, but they found some interesting things. One was that they found that he was carrying this medicinal mushroom here, a birch polypore. This is a relative of chaga. He was carrying that. He was carrying a fungal medicine with him. And another thing that was interesting they discovered was that he had tattoos on acupuncture points. Well, it wasn't enough to protect him from somebody who was mad at him because he got shot in the back with an arrow as he was leaving the village. So he must have done something that was not appreciated. But anyway, he had some good medicines on him, and I think it's a very interesting story. Okay, so now we have more formulas, and these are just things that have chaga in them. There's a whole lot of ways of using chaga. So you can see it's used for boosting respiratory immunity, increasing vitality and immunity. And now we have another fungus, and this is the cordyceps. And cordyceps is very interesting because it's a fungus that attacks other things and it manipulates their brains. It takes control of their consciousness. And so here it is growing out of some kind of larvae. So basically, in Chinese, cordyceps is called summer worm winter grass. In the summer, it's a caterpillar, and then the fungus kills it in the fall, and it sprouts. And so this is the cordyceps. It does this to all kinds of creatures. It's a great story, which I don't have time to tell you, but it's a major herb for fungal infections. I mean, for viral infections. So here's a couple studies. This tells us that viral infections are among the most common diseases. New species are always emerging. There's limited drugs available. And this is a review of the known viral actions and mechanisms. And the second tells us that there's a compound, okay, cordycepin, from cordyceps, suppresses replication of several viruses, including influenza. And plants get viral diseases also. It suppresses HIV, leukemia virus, Epstein-Barr, and it also has anti-tumor effects. So cordyceps is a major medicinal mushroom that you would like to add to your pharmacy if you have one of these chronic viral loads. And here's the Epstein-Barr virus. It's in the herpes virus family, and in the herpes family, and it's one of the most common viruses. It's the cause of infectious mononucleosis, but it's also known now as being a significant contributing factor to chronic fatigue syndrome. So a lot of people have Epstein-Barr viral load that goes in kind of a cyclical manner, and it's important to take the immune boosting herbs when it's more in remission, and then to take the attacking antiviral herbs when it's flared up. And we'll be talking about how to do those two things in the next class. But there's a lot of things here with combining the adaptogens and the aromatics that you're going to see in the formulas coming up fairly soon. Some more about the Epstein-Barr. No, I'm sorry. This is about immune modulating effects. Okay, this is just a clinical trial. It's always good to read the clinical trials. And what they found was this particular compound that they were extracting from the cordyceps is safe and effective for enhancing cell-mediated immunity in healthy adults. Always nice to know that taking fungi is safe and effective. All right. And again, here's another formula for increasing vitality and immunity. That's just a duplicate there. Reishi mushroom. All right. So the reishi mushroom, you know, it's very interesting because chaga has a lot of studies about antiviral powers, but the reishi is more about anti-cancer. But there's still quite a bit, actually. So the first report here mentions a traditional Chinese formula. It's an herbal combination of two things that's been found potently effective against hepatitis B in vitro and in vivo. And the second report here mentions is on herpes, okay? And two proteins from the reishi mushroom have potent antiviral activity against herpes simplex 1 and 2. Going quickly here, because we want to get to the formulas in a couple of minutes, we see here that reishi is also used for carcinoma caused by nasopharyngeal carcinoma, which is one of the potential carcinogenic effects of Epstein-Barr virus. And reishi is used for dengue also. And this is a, oops, have things overlapped here. This is a very nice table showing all the different compounds. Well, these are all from different types of Ganoderma, which are all reishis. There's many species. So if it says Ganoderma, all of these are reishis against all of these different viruses. Okay, how they were extracted, what the compounds were, the method, and you tell me. Those are the analysis of how effective they were. Okay, like 87% clearance of virus, things like that. And this is where my eyes glaze over when it gets this mathematical. Here are some more formulas. I'm getting a lot of formulas here. I advise that you try these. Just start taking a little bit of this. Add to your pharmacy. Maybe you have a pharmacy already. What you can start to do is you can start to put some things together because these formulas are all based on combining the adaptogens in this section with the aromatics. Okay, from the last section. There's a lot of these kind of things. So you're going to see ginger and tulsi. Okay, that's from the last section. And then you're going to have astragalus and reishi, like this. And there's other things that we're not covering, but you probably know about or you've heard, ashwagandha and milky oat seed and so forth. So there's a lot of different things here for you to try. And this is a good way to do a long-term protection plan against neurodegenerative conditions, all right? This is like herbal life insurance here. And the concept is you rotate through a different herb once a day. All right, so on day 1, you take turmeric, day 2, you take reishi, day 3, you take bacopa. These are all neuroprotective. But then you can also combine it with essential oils and aromatherapy because those are neuroprotective as well because they go straight to the brain. So it's not a question of, oh, you have an herb that's neuroprotective, take a lot of it. It's that we're microdosing with it and we're rotating through various species. So we're working on the brain on lots of different levels here. So turmeric, anti-inflammatory. Reishi has many, many ways of working on the brain. Bacopa has many nutrients for the brain. Hawthorn improves cerebral circulation to the brain. Lion's mane specific for the brain. Ginkgo improves circulation to the brain. Gotu kola, more nutrients. Lots of different things there. So here we have licorice. There's a lot of studies about licorice. Now, the one thing that I'm going to say about licorice is that it's very important not to take licorice at all if you have kidney disease, if you have hypertension, or you have water retention, okay? These are 3 things that licorice is contraindicated for. The culprit is a compound called glycyrrhizin, or glycyrrhizic acid, and there's, interestingly enough, a lot of studies about glycyrrhizic acid, and they're using it with great success in IVs. But it's also something that we have to be aware of, that it has these warnings and contraindications of these 3 things. Again, that's kidney disease, hypertension, and edema, okay? But otherwise, it's perfectly safe to take it in low doses, okay? For shorter periods of time, that's what I recommend. And you will see a specific schedule of take it 3 times a day for a week for acute conditions. Take it once or twice a day for 2 weeks for moderate conditions. Then just kind of rotate through it otherwise, all right? But this will all be outlined here very clearly. All right, so what comes next? Just overview here of licorice first. This gives a long list of viruses here in this overview that it works against. And then the second one is that it basically just tells us that, no, I'm sorry, it's the second study here that has this long list. The first study tells us that it has different mechanisms against HIV and against herpes simplex. And the second gives a very long list. Here it is, down here. All of these, HIV, SARS-related coronavirus. Well, it turns out the licorice is now the main herb that's in all kinds of formulas being used against COVID-19 in China, okay? And then the respiratory syncytial virus and arboviruses, all these kinds of things. So licorice is a major antiviral herb. All right, I am going to just scroll through these slides now with no further commentary because we just have a few more. And this is just reading material. Some of you may find that this material helps you get to sleep at night. Some of you may find that this is tremendously exciting. So I find it interesting. I enjoy this level of learning. And I'll just mention that just in doing some research this morning, I found the cure for COVID-19. And it's right here in the American Southwestern states. I will tell you in our next installment, so make sure and come back. So here are some things about glycyrrhizin and the way that they are using it intravenously for hepatitis. And some more about that. I gave several of these studies because it's very interesting how they're using this concentrated substance. And by the way, if you can't take the licorice, take DGL, deglycerized licorice, which you can find in capsules. More licorice studies. And here are licorice formulas. Lots of formulas have licorice, colds and flus and bronchitis and cough and detoxification from smoking and management of asthma, dyspepsia and indigestion, hydrochloric acid imbalances, food poisoning, bacterial infections, chronic adrenal overstimulation, antidepressant, PMS, menopausal insomnia, hot flashes, restoring exhausted adrenal functions, and enhancing natural respiratory detoxification. And finally, rhodiola. But it's too late for rhodiola, except to say that it enhances athletic performance, which means that it's very good as an adaptogen. It's also been found to block the Ebola virus. And here's the Ebola virus. Not that we're going to be dealing with it, but if it can block the Ebola virus, it can probably block the Rhinovirus and dengue. And here's the dengue virus. And here are some formulas with rhodiola. And we are done. Okay, we did it. So James, I think you can take me off of that screen share now and just go back to camera, and we can take some questions. And guess what? I only went 1 minute over.
Guess what, David? All right. So take a drink. That's a good thing for you to do at this point. And
Ginger tea.
Yeah, this is what we started with, right?
Right.
Ginger wove its all the way through. Well, it was interesting comments in the beginning, your opening comments, just introducing the thinking around the studies that are happening around botanical antivirals now, and likening, the scientific research really to the allopathic model, but it's very much reductionist thinking. Wouldn't you find that reductionist thinking, reductionist approach to isolate a specific compound out of a substance and target it without having all of the rest of the herbal components that balance it and are the cofactors for it, etc.?
Yeah, that is the definition of reductionistic science, and that's the purpose of pharmaceutical research.
Mm.
And the reason that they're researching that is because if you can target something with a specific compound, one is you will get a more concentrated effect. The second thing is that you're going to have more biocompatibility and resistance issues. But the third thing is you're going to make money. Okay, and that's also what's driving this. But the reason that I find this very interesting is because there's so much validation that's coming from the scientific community about plants as a source of medicines. And keep in mind that plants have always been the source of medicines. It's just that we've never had this kind of these kind of extracting methods before, you see. But it goes back a long ways. Keep in mind that the extracted alkaloids have been with us since the early 1800s. Okay, morphine and strychnine and cocaine and all of these alkaloids were extracted as the first pharmaceutical drugs. And obviously, they have had a huge impact in society, both positive and negative. So there's, like I said, there's no guarantee about anything, because there's no guarantee that a pharmaceutical drug is good or bad. And there's no guarantee that the herbs are going to be particularly good or bad either, you see. So I don't think that reductionistic science is bad in that sense. I think it's just a different way of relating to nature and different way of relating to the body.
Yeah.
So I think that we're going to be faced collectively with a lot of these kind of questions from here on. And we're definitely going through a big learning curve in society right now with the pandemic, certainly in forcing people to think about their health, but it's also going to be forcing people to think about the role of vaccines and will they do a vaccine if it comes out, and what are the other options? You see, because if you look at the role of allopathic medicine, it has changed the course of history. Without a doubt. I mean, antibiotics have saved countless millions of people's lives, okay? Even my own, all right? I was once faced with a life-threatening illness that was cured by 10 days of flagyl. And paradoxically, it was from studying Ayurvedic medicine in Kathmandu. So there's a place for these medicines, but the issue is not whether the drugs are good or bad. The issue is how they're abused. And antibiotics have been abused, and that's a medical, political, pharmaceutical, economic problem that led to them being abused. Because if we had the knowledge and the wisdom about antibiotics now that we have now, if we had had that, 75 years ago, antibiotics would not have developed the level of resistance. So it's not that the molecules are bad, it's that they have a place. And anybody who is suffering will want to be free of that suffering. And if pharmaceutical medicine helps them be free of that suffering, then that's great. But the reason people are turning to natural medicine is because the pharmaceutical drugs are not freeing them from suffering in many cases. There are very specific ways that allopathic medicine is really the best thing. And then outside of that, it's really natural medicine. But natural medicine requires a high level of responsibility, and it requires a high level of resources economically. Unfortunately, herbal medicine is really a luxury for the wealthy unless you know how to wild harvest or grow your own. Unfortunately, that's true. So it's not a matter of this system is better than this. It's that they work in different ways, and one is better than another at different times for different people in different places. That's all. That's how I think about it.
Thanks. You mentioned extracting. So much extracting is happening now, and there's different extracting methods. I wonder if you've heard of herbs being extracted with CO2.
Oh, sure. Yeah. That's been around a long time, and actually that's used more widely in the food industry, really. So anytime.
They're using a lot in cannabis. There's a herbalist in Sonoma County that is doing it across the board with many different herbs, and the taste, the flavor of it is just remarkable. The terpene content that's extracted is just a really beautiful thing. Okay, on to other questions about adaptogens. This question.
Are these things people are asking?
Yes.
Oh, wonderful. I didn't see them come in.
Well, these questions that I'm about to ask came in ahead of time.
Oh, wonderful.
And,
okay.
and I'll take care of the rest of the questions.
Okay,
so, so she didn't hear the presentation. It's 1 o'clock in the morning where she is right now, so she's gonna listen to the replay.
Okay,
but she's wondering about which adaptogens that you consider safe to consume on a regular basis.
All of them. That's one of their that's one of their basic criteria, is that they're safe to consume on a regular basis. You see. Now, there are some things that are classified as adaptogens that do have a few contraindications or concerns of potential adverse reactions. And first of all, this is all dose dependent. Okay, so if you take too much of any adaptogen, it can have an adverse reaction. So when I say they're safe to consume on an ongoing basis, I'm talking about taking reasonable doses. And those are outlined very clearly in the formulas. Mm-hmm. So if you want to take something like chaga or reishi, it's quite safe on a daily basis for almost everybody to take it once a day. It's even safer for people to take it, say, 3 times a week. Now, one of the contraindications, there's very few contraindications or warnings here, but whenever you have any complex medical conditions, or you're on medications, or you're going for a surgery, always think about what herbs are you on. Okay, so reishi, for example, is a very mild blood thinner. And there's a theoretical concern. Most herb-drug interactions are theoretical concerns, but there's a theoretical concern that if you were to take like a lot of reishi, like day after day after day, right up to the day of your surgery, that it might have a blood thinning effect that could enhance bleeding. And I don't think this is that significant, but just don't do that. That's all. Don't take large doses of reishi every day right up until a major surgery. Stop a week or two before. And that way, you're going to prevent one or both problems here. One is that there could be some blood thinning. And more importantly, if there's any complications, the doctor's not going to be able to blame you. Okay, so I always say, if you're getting involved with Western medicine at that particular level, just take the other things out for a little while. okay, if you don't know what's going on. Now, of course, people don't. And there's something like 50 million Americans every single day who take herbs along with their prescription drugs, okay? And adverse reactions are very, very rare, but it's my responsibility to just tell you, don't take reishi before a surgery, okay? What else? The Korean and Chinese red ginseng, the one that's real hot, steamed, that's not good for people with hypertension. American ginseng is much, much better. Rhodiola, if you take it in higher doses, it might make you a little bit nervous. What else? Schizandra, if you take too much, it might upset your stomach. I mean, that's basically about it. And all of these things are completely avoided if you just cycle through things. And so that's how I do things. I have a nice pharmacy of adaptogens. And some days I'll take a dose of chaga. Some days I won't. Some days I'll take a dose of American ginseng. And some days I won't. Like that. So I just kind of cycle through things. And a lot of the adaptogens mix very nicely with food also. I like to take the American ginseng and the cordyceps and the milky oat seed in the oatmeal. It's very nice. So that's the answer to that question. They're not problematic. You can take them on an ongoing basis, but it's dose dependent. And you do not have to take large doses of adaptogens either. Okay, here's the main thing. If you are deeply depleted, really weak, blood deficient, qi deficient, as they say in Chinese medicine, recovering from a serious debilitating illness, and you start taking adaptogens, you're going to feel it. You're going to feel much better taking adaptogens, okay? Now, if you're basically healthy and you take adaptogens, you're not going to feel much because you're already there. And that can be a little deceptive because people say, oh, I want to feel something. And so they take bigger doses. And then the adaptogens, if you overdo it and you don't need it, they can make you feel a little overstimulated, that's all. But you can also combine things, like you saw the one study very briefly about how rhodiola can be taken before a workout and it can improve your endurance and your performance. And that's how rhodiola became famous in the athletic world, actually. So these are kinds of things that you think about. Now, the best way to approach the adaptogens, small doses over a long period of time. And you don't notice anything, except that all your friends are aging faster than you are, okay? Now, basic principle, higher doses, and this is for all herbs, okay? Higher doses for shorter times for acute conditions. Lower doses for longer times for chronic conditions, all right? So if you have a chronic condition, don't try to hit it heavily with everything all at once, because chances are the chronic condition is going to affect your digestive system and you may be more sensitive and so forth. So again, higher doses, shorter time, acute conditions, lower doses, longer time, chronic conditions. Now, in the next installment of this, there's going to be a lot of these principles of formulating that we're going to cover, because that's when we're going to start mixing in the bitter, strong berberine-based herbs and a bunch of other clinical types of herbs that have some low-grade toxicity or they're slightly biocompatible. You should use them only for the attacking purposes, the antiviral. These two groups of herbs that we covered today, the aromatics and the adaptogens, were really things that everybody can use all the time. You can drink peppermint tea. You can drink Tulsi tea. You can take cordyceps and reishi. These are things that are broad spectrum, non-specific, very biocompatible for everybody. In the next installment, we're going to cover things, that are much more problematic in terms of dosage and timing and how to blend it. So it's going to be a more complex type of formulary that you'll get. How's that?
Okay, thanks, David. Good. I'm going to give you a follow-up question to this.
Okay.
With adaptogenic herbs, and this is for an example of autoimmune condition like Hashimoto's. Is there any of the herbs that you've mentioned that should be consumed with caution or not at all when somebody has Hashi's?
Well, with autoimmune conditions, the basic principle is that you don't want to be using immune stimulants. Now, there's only one herb that's actually recognized as a significant immune stimulant, and that's echinacea. Okay. And elderberry is sort of rumored to be immune stimulant, but it's really more antiviral than anything. So that's the main concern. But what you find is that a lot of adaptogens are used for autoimmune conditions. But here's the thing is that you have to, you can't think about it generically like that. You can't just say autoimmune, adaptogen, yes, no. Okay, that's reductionistic thinking in herbal medicine. You have to say autoimmune condition, and then you have to say excess heat, inflammation, or you have to say deficient, cold, less inflammation. All right. That means that there's not a simple answer because there's all kinds of autoimmune disorders and there's all sorts of phases and they're always changing, you see. So the general principle is that when an autoimmune condition is more on the Qi deficient, blood deficient, Yang deficient, more on the cold, weak side, that's when the adaptogens can be given. And they can be very helpful. There's a number of adaptogens that are used in autoimmune conditions, okay? But there's also autoimmune conditions where adaptogens should not be used because they're more building, you see. So with Graves' disease, all right, with Hashimoto's, it's more of a deficient situation. It's hypothyroid, okay? And so the appearance is more Qi deficient. And so the adaptogens are more suited for that than say an autoimmune disorder like Graves' disease, which is hot, okay? It's hyper, okay? So that's the main thing is that you have to break down autoimmune conditions into the two primary categories of excess deficient, hot or cold. But then you also have to look at them according to the individual disease because there's so many autoimmune conditions. But then you have to look at the individual and the current status. Because even within a particular autoimmune disorder, within a particular individual, they could have a cycle of time where adaptogens are needed and they work really well. And then in another cycle of time, they shouldn't be given. So it's more of an individual prescription. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So same kind of question, but in relation to pregnancy, any herbs that you mentioned tonight that can be or should not be taken during pregnancy?
In general, again, all the things that we covered are commonly used in pregnancy, actually. The adaptogens are safe, but again, it's just a matter of, you know, lower the dose, lower the frequency, that's all. Licorice, possibly problematic, but I know that it's been used by countless women throughout history because it goes into all kinds of formulas that are used during pregnancy. But it's one of those theoretical concerns. Okay. Let's see what else. Otherwise,
one more question.
I would say the aromatics, if they are brewed too strong, excuse me, if they're brewed too strong, okay, they can be problematic for women who are weak and have a history or a propensity towards a miscarriage. So if you have had miscarriages, don't drink really strong ginger tea. That's all. Make it mild, and that can help with the nausea, without a doubt. So it's dose dependent, concentration dependent. What else?
Last question here is, do you foresee that climate change will change the variety and abundance of botanicals to our detriment, or do you think that botanicals will adapt and change under different conditions and provide us with new benefits?
Well, It'll be both, but it'll probably be a negative impact overall, because it's a natural resource, and it's a very valuable natural resource, and it's in terms of the plants in their natural environment, a lot of things are threatened and endangered. And in terms of climate change itself, well, some plants will be happy and some plants won't, but it's going to be the impact of people more than the impact of climate change.
Yeah.
And the impact of climate change will affect people, and then people will affect the environment. And one of the things that we could look at, for example, is deforestation. And deforestation and climate change are linked, but it's because of people. And deforestation is, endangering a lot of plants. Now, on the other side of the equation, there is something very positive that is coming out of the pandemic and will be coming out of climate change also. And that is that people are realizing that these plants are important, and they're starting to grow their own. And so there's a movement now towards mushroom cultivation and towards home gardens and things like that, and community gardens. And there's going to be a lot more movement towards sustainable agricultural projects because these plants are going to be very valuable. But they're just part of the bigger agricultural trends that are happening. And to go back to the impact of climate change, well, it doesn't matter how many neighborhoods have their own herbal gardens if they're going underwater or they're going up in flames. And that's basically what we're facing here in the United States, is that climate change is basically dividing the country into half of it's going to be underwater and half of it's going to be on fire. And under those circumstances, well, we have to ask more basic questions like, well, what's going to happen to the food chain? What's going to happen to agriculture? And agriculture has been heavily, heavily impacted by the pandemic, you see. So climate change, pandemics, agriculture, environment, ecosystems, medicinal plants, all these things are closely, closely intertwined. And I would say that overall the adverse impacts are widespread and negative, but within that there are still plants that are going to be perfectly happy in a hotter climate. And there's going to be lots of opportunity for people to have sustainable cultivation projects of very, very valuable cash crops. Medicinal plants are going to be increasingly valuable. So will food, and so will water, actually. All of the natural resources are going to be in much higher demand and going to cost more and more rare. So this is, one aspect of just natural resources in general.
Thank you, David. I think we can call this a wrap. I've got some closing comments. So, yeah, given the volume of this information, we were sure to record this, and it'll be available on our website under archived webinars in just a few days. As usual, there's a short survey to fill out after the webinar ends. It sure would help me to have your feedback and your comments about this presentation. So I sure appreciate you taking the time for that. And we're talking about David coming back for the second part of this presentation on June 16th, when he'll be sharing information on the power of bitter alkaloid-based botanicals with antiviral properties, as well as protecting the lungs, herbs and essential oils with antiviral powers for respiratory system health. So good things yet to come. I think that concludes today's presentation. I'm grateful that I work with James Bernardinelli too, who engineers these webinars. So thank you for that, James. Thanks again, David, for everything that you brought to this presentation, all your expertise and insights. And thank you, everyone, for sharing this educational experience with us together. I want to wish you all the best of health, and I sure look forward to learning more together at our next All About Alumni webinars and All About Alumni in next webinar with David. Until then, I'm going to continue to practice my botanical health and happiness and compassion and kindness, because what we practice we go stronger from what we practice. So please join me in this too. And until we meet again, I hope you all take the best of care. It sure matters so much right now.